I ended up getting diverted into writing a book solely about the pandemic. At the time, I thought I could do it actually quite quickly, which meant for me about 2 to 2.5 years. But I bit off a little bit more than I expected, and the book took 7 years. For the first 5.5 years of that, I was having great difficulty and really wanted to throw the whole thing out the window. There's a character in the book named Oswald Avery who kind of inspired me. He ended up with one of the most important scientific discoveries of the 20th century, which grew out of influenza research, as a matter of fact. And he was the person who discovered the DNA carried the genetic code. That didn't come till 1944. And almost from the period of the pandemic until 1944, shortly after the pandemic at any rate, he started working on this problem that ended up with that. And he had a hell of a time. He'd go more than 10 years without publishing a single scientific article. Essentially had a nervous breakdown. At any rate, his persistence kind of inspired me and kept me going, because believe me, I wanted to quit several times. Then about 5.5 years into the process, the book sort of came together in my head. In the last 1.5 years, I was happy that I had started it. And of course, the response has been pretty good, both in the scientific community and in terms of commercial. That's how I started it. Do you want to ask another question? You want me to just keep talking, or how do we want to handle this? Okay, I guess I'll keep talking. The pandemic, it was a respiratory virus, of course. All influenza viruses have a natural reservoir in birds. So in a sense, they're all bird flu. But that virus is one of the most rapidly mutating in existence. It jumps species often. It can infect every mammal. And in probably before 1918, but no later than January 1918, it did jump species to humans. It took a while to adapt to people and spread widely. It was a lethal pandemic. Fortunately, what we're going through right now, as bad as it is not nearly as lethal as 1918. Worldwide, it killed between 50 and 100 million people. If you adjust for population, that would be equivalent to about 220 million to 440 million people today. As I said, fortunately, that's not what we're facing, even in a worst case scenario with COVID-19.
So therefore, you're saying that it's a bit cavalier to compare the 1918 pandemic to COVID-19.
Well, there are a lot of similarities. But in terms of virulence and death toll and things like that, fortunately, we're not facing it. In terms of many other elements of the pandemic, they're remarkably similar. The chief similarities are obviously, they're both respiratory viruses primarily, and yet the pathology is very unusual. Both in 1918 and today, that virus seems to be able to infect practically every organ. There's a lot of publicity right now about neurological damage caused by COVID-19. The same thing occurred in 1918. In fact, comprehensive reviews, scientific assessments written several years after the pandemic said that neurological symptoms were second only to pulmonary. But autopsies from 1918 found practically every kidney damaged, damage to testes. They found changes in the brain, all sorts of very unusual findings. When so-called bird flu H5N1 surfaced in first surfaced in 1997, then it resurfaced in the early 2000s. Autopsy findings there said that these things have never been reported before in influenza. And in fact, they were all reported in 1918 because H5N1 also infected quite a few different organs. So, the similarities are, they're both respiratory viruses primarily. They can infect all sorts of organs, which is very unusual for any pathogen or any virus anyway. A lot of neurological damage, incidentally. They tend to kill the same way. One of the main avenues or one of the main pathologies in 1918 was so-called cytokine storm, which I'm sure you've all heard of. That's when your immune system overreacts in the lung. And the effort by the immune system to destroy the virus inside the lung ends up destroying the lung's ability to transfer oxygen to the blood, and either that and you're essentially drowned in fluids as well. So that's one of the main pathologies of COVID-19 as well as 1918. The difference between both ordinary influenza and the 1918 virus is also the difference between COVID-19 and SARS and MERS, two other coronaviruses, which have, of course, killed people in the last 15 or 20 years. Most influenza viruses will only bind to cells in your upper respiratory tract. That they will not bind to cells deep in the lung. Therefore, they are highly transmissible, and certainly influenza can kill, but it very rarely causes viral pneumonia, kills through other means. The 1918 virus could bind both to cells in the upper respiratory tract, which made it highly transmissible, and it could bind to cells deep in the lung. So you're essentially starting out with viral pneumonia. SARS and MERS are two coronaviruses that bind to cells deep in the lung. So you're starting out with a pretty dangerous disease to begin with, but they do not bind to cells in the upper respiratory tract, which is why they were easy to control. We were able to completely eliminate SARS from the human population, and MERS is still around, but it doesn't spread, does not cause widespread disease. Similarly, the coronaviruses that cause the common cold, they bind to cells in the upper respiratory tract, so they're easily transmissible, but they won't bind to cells in your lung, so they're not deadly. COVID-19 does both, as did the 1918 virus. So those are the similarities. The chief differences, aside from the virulence, in 1918, as I already said, was much more deadly. The chief differences involve timing. The incubation rate for influenza is 1 to 4 days. The incubation rate and most people get sick at about 2 days. The incubation rate for COVID-19 is 2 to 14 days. Most people get sick at 5 or 6 days. People also are sick longer with COVID-19 than with influenza, and they can shed virus for a longer period of time, so they're infectious longer. In both diseases, you can transmit the virus, you can infect somebody else before you have any symptoms, but for influenza, it's a relatively short time. For COVID-19, well, you could be, if it's so-called pre-symptomatic, you would start shedding as much as 2 days before you have any symptoms. But there are also people who never develop symptoms and can shed virus and infect other people. But that duration, that time difference, means that in influenza, whether it's seasonal influenza today or the 1918 virus, a given community, the virus would move through a given community in a relatively short period of time, generally 6 to 10 weeks. And although the 1918 pandemic lasted, you'd say from 1918 through 1920 and had several waves, roughly 2/3 of the deaths, close to that number, were compressed into a period of 14 and 15 weeks between mid-September and December of 1918. So just that's an extraordinary death toll in an incredibly short period of time. As I said a minute ago, in any particular city, it was even shorter than that. COVID-19, even if we had done nothing in terms of interventions, locking down places, so forth and so on, the virus would move much more slowly through a community. And of course, we have tried to even slow the transmission artificially, stretches things out, puts more stress on the economy, but does save lives. And I fully support the public health measures that have been taken. And I wish more have been taken.
Just to interject for a moment, I was looking at the political climate of this and the Spanish flu. I was fascinated by your description of President Woodrow Wilson as a man who believed almost to the point of mental illness in his own righteousness and his efforts to control the press by the Sedition Act. That right. a different spin on the relatively mild, events of today. Do you see any parallels to the quote unquote fake news and bravado of President Trump?
Yeah, the parallels are very obvious. The motivation's quite different. Wilson was focused entirely on the war. That's the only thing that mattered to him. He had some reason to be concerned going into the war. The largest demographic group in the United States was of German descent. So he had some concern, although there are relatively few recent German immigrants. Nonetheless, they had some concern whether German Americans would go to war against Germany. By the same token, there were a large number of Irish immigrants. And in 1916, in Dublin, there had been the Easter uprising against English rule or British rule of Ireland. So I had concerns whether the Irish would fight against on the side of England against Germany and so forth. And it probably would have done these same things anyway. He even said that at one point, thank God for Abraham Lincoln, I won't make the mistakes he made. And he was referring to the fact that during the Civil War, although Lincoln in some measure took very extreme actions, suspending habeas corpus and so forth, he allowed the press to operate freely. And he was subjected to intense criticism, some brutal criticism in a free press. And Wilson wanted to prevent that from happening. So he took two actions. Number one, he passed a Sedition Act, which made it punishable by 20 years in jail. To quote, this is a direct quote from the law. I don't even said it often enough. I don't have to look at it. Illegal to utter, write, print, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the former government of the United States. This act was enforced. A congressman was sentenced to more than 10 years in prison under that. There were several thousand prosecutions. At the same time, he created something he called the Committee for Public Information. The architect of that committee said, nothing in experience teaches us that truth is superior to falsehood. It matters very little whether something is true or false. All that matters is its inspirational value. So they had roughly 100,000 people they called 4-minute men, who before every public gathering, if I were actually speaking physically at the library, it would be before a talk like this, before every vaudeville show, before every school board meeting, and so forth and so on. Someone would get up for 4 minutes and put out the line of the day, which was designed to keep morale up. They banned from army camps such songs as I Wonder Who's Kissing Her Now. That was bad for morale. So you had both the stick from that Sedition Act private individuals making comments privately could be and were prosecuted under that. You didn't have to get up front and other people make a speech to get prosecuted. And at the same time, the press, self-censorship, there was plenty of fake news in 1918, but it was fake because the press was repeating what the government wanted it to. So this was an important background. It's sort of an infrastructure into which the pandemic fell. Again, Wilson was focused on the war, didn't want any negative news printed anywhere. As a result, there was no Tony Fauci back then. National public health leaders were saying really ridiculous things, such as this is ordinary influenza by another name. It wasn't ordinary influenza by another name. People could die in 12 hours from their first symptoms. They could die with horrific symptoms. Probably the scariest would be bleeding not only from the nose, which was quite common, where we have good data from army camps. Some of them, 15% of the soldiers had nosebleed, but you could also bleed from your mouth and even your eyes and ears. Those are pretty scary symptoms. So you have rapid deaths, horrific symptoms, a lot of people dying in an incredibly short time period. And one other important difference between 1918 and COVID-19 is the target demographic of the virus. In 1918, 95% of all the excess deaths were people younger than 65. The peak age for death was 28. Plenty of very young children died as well. But over 60% of the deaths were people aged 18 to 45, 50 or so. Obviously, that's not the case now. But you had, most cities, almost all of them, the local press was echoing that line that I just quoted from a national public health leader, that this is ordinary influenza by another name. It was referred to as Spanish influenza, although it did not start in Spain. We don't know where it started, possibly even Kansas, but it certainly didn't start in Spain. And the result of this disconnect between these rapid deaths, these horrific symptoms, these bodies literally piling up, mass graves being dug in some cities. Well, Wilmington's pretty close to Philadelphia, is one of the hardest hit cities in the country. That were digging mass graves in Philadelphia. I don't offhand recall how bad it got in Wilmington. In Philadelphia, they were literally priests driving horse-drawn carts down the street, calling upon people to bring out their dead. So you're being told this is ordinary influenza by another name. You're being told you have nothing to fear if proper precautions are taken. And yet people are experiencing this kind of death and desolation and horrific symptoms. And the result was real panic developed in a lot of places. And to the extent that in some places you have reports that people were starving to death because no one had the courage to bring them food, including other family members. We're not facing a situation like that, obviously, thank God.
You spent a great...
Go ahead.
Yeah, you spent a great deal of time describing how the development of the medical system of the time impacted the outbreak. What problems with our medical system today do you see as detrimental to controlling the pandemic?
What could you repeat that? What part of the medical system is detrimental?
Yeah, what problems with our medical system?
Oh, problems. Okay.
Do you see as detrimental to controlling this pandemic?
I'm not sure I'd put it quite that way. Obviously, if a healthcare system locally gets overwhelmed, the case fatality rate is going to go way up. In Wuhan, the case fatality rate was 5.8%. It was 0.7% in the rest of China. And the difference was the healthcare system didn't have any ICU beds in Wuhan. The rest of China, they did. That's the whole idea of flattening the curve, which we've all had that problem of being forced to stay home and so forth. And, the economy to a significant extent being shut down for the purpose of flattening the curve. Right now in Houston and several other cities, they're facing the threat of running out of ICU beds. And the number of beds per capita has gone down dramatically over the last 30, 40 years in the United States. Hospitals have become more and more business-like, more and more just-in-time economy, which is another problem in terms of supply chains. That has been a big problem. Obviously, providing so-called PPEs, personal protective equipment. All of this stuff was foreseeable, and not only was foreseeable, but was foreseen. Going back to about the time that so-called bird flu surfaced, H5N1, my book happened to come out at about the same time. The George W. Bush administration passed a $7 billion bill designed to most of the money going to pandemic preparedness or preparing for bioterrorism events, and creating the national stockpile, investing in vaccine manufacturing technology and capacity. Some of that's in the Delaware area. And part of that involved a planning process that, because of my knowledge of what had happened in 1918, I was asked to participate in that. I think the clearest lesson from 1918, which I used to preach in every meeting I went to and nobody ever disagreed with me, was number one, tell the truth. In 1918, so I was saying earlier, national public health leaders, and in most cases, local public health leaders, did not tell the truth. As a result, people died who would otherwise have survived. In addition, there was tremendous level of fear out there that, there's every reason to be afraid of that virus. I described some of the symptoms. It was lethal. But you can function and not panic. In the book I talked a little, I compared Philadelphia and San Francisco. Both of them were very hard hit. I think they were like fourth and fifth in terms of excess mortality. So San Francisco didn't get off lightly by any stretch. But in Philadelphia, the city almost collapsed in some ways. There was, for example, calls for volunteers that went unanswered until the woman in charge of volunteering, the volunteer effort, castigated in the people for not responding. And there was he was a medical student then, became a prominent physician later. He drove 12 miles home every day from his emergency hospital. And one time in a drive, and there were so few cars on the road that he started counting them. One evening in a drive of 12 miles in what was then the third biggest city in the United States, he did not see one other car on the road. He said the life of the city is almost stopped. That was because of fear. That wasn't because anybody had issued closing orders, although Philadelphia eventually did close schools, bars, restaurants, and so forth, not all businesses. By contrast, in San Francisco, and Philadelphia was one of the places where lies were told, even after when the death toll's climbing and they finally do close schools, bars, restaurants, theaters, churches. Even after that, when those measures were taken, one of the newspapers actually said, quote, This is not a public health measure. You have no cause for alarm, unquote. I mean, of course it's a public health measure. How stupid did they think people were? So if you read that, you know you're being lied to. You have no place to turn except your own resources. You can't trust anybody else or anything else. And that society began almost, I don't want to overstate and say disintegrate, but it began to fray. In San Francisco, by contrast, the mayor, health officials, business leaders, union leaders jointly issued a statement, huge print, full page in the newspaper. It said, wear a mask and save your life. That is a very different message than this is ordinary influenza by another name. You have nothing to fear, proper precautions are taken. And in San Francisco, when they closed schools, for example, there were plenty of volunteers. Teachers volunteered for everything from telephone operators to ambulance drivers. That city functioned. There was still plenty of fear, and as I said, San Francisco was quite hard hit, but it functioned much better than Philadelphia. You know, what we're facing today is quite different. We have, I mean, it's infuriating to me because this virus could be contained. It can be contained without destroying the economy if we do it right. Other countries have done it right. It is in Trump's self-interest to do it right, but he's either too stupid or too pig-headed, because it would involve admitting error, to do it the right way. Again, it's crazy because it would, you know, when this thing happened, it could have guaranteed, if he'd handled it properly, he could have guaranteed his reelection. You know, in Germany, which had a bad start, similar to our bad start, but got way ahead of it, again, without destroying the economy, their death toll on a per capita basis is a tiny fraction of ours, and Merkel's approval ratings are in the 70%, 77% was their high, something like that.
And so that leads to a question from one of the people that are present here in this feed, and they ask, and you have addressed some of this, what has been the difference between the government's response in the 1918 pandemic and our present COVID-19?
Well, again, in 1918, the federal government did nothing, but of course, it was a different situation. There was a Surgeon General. He was the one who said, this is, you have nothing to fear if ordinary precautions are taken. Finally, after things got really pretty bad, too late, he did recommend closing schools and so forth. But practically every decision was made at a local level, not even a state level. I don't recall a single state where they issued statewide orders. Almost every city, but not every city, did eventually close things down. One of the reasons I was asked to get involved was because I had studied this, and you know, the cities that acted earlier, before the virus was widely disseminated, you know, they had a better outcome. Cities who acted later, after the virus is already all over the place, you're going to have much less impact by closing things down. You know, in many southern states where we're facing that situation right now, where, you know, there are so many cases. In fact, someone from the CDC, I think just today, made the comment that it's going to be very, very difficult to get ahead of the curve. You know, in terms of Trump's actions, the testing debacle, which continues to haunt us, there are a lot of people being tested now, and yet it's not just tests. And a lot of those tests, if you walk into a hospital for any cause now, you're being tested. You know, there are roughly 500,000 tests a day being given right now. But several, I've forgotten the exact number, but several 100,000 of those are already accounted for as routine, that are not really while they are testing for the disease, as I said, there are roughly 100,000 tests accounted for just by everybody walking into a hospital for any reason, for admission. They're being tested routinely. But the contact tracing, we have a enormous gap that is not working well in most states. In Louisiana, the target was to contact 75% of people within 48 hours, and there's simply people aren't picking up the phone. The governor down here has complained publicly, urged people to respond, and so forth. That's very important, getting ahead of the virus. They managed to do it not only in Asian countries, but in Austria, Germany, Australia, New Zealand. England has, not done very well, but they're doing a lot better than we are. In Italy and France, where the disease just seems so out of control. I mean, their curve has gone like this, and now it's stayed down because they're testing and tracing and monitoring the disease, and they got it to a low enough level they can safely reopen things fully without really warning you, constantly monitor for a resurgence. But our curve is gone like this, and then like that, and then like that, and in some states it's going back up like that. We did not have testing in place. We do not now have contact tracing in place. The mixed messaging coming out of the administration. Now we finally have, even the vice president the other day wore a mask publicly and urged people to wear a mask. We have, Republican leadership. Today or yesterday, the House Republican leader urged people to wear masks, and so forth and so on. It's finally penetrated beyond everywhere, really, except for Trump himself. He's really the only one. And, his messaging has confused the public. And he's politicized public health. It's crazy.
So with the 1918 pandemic, were there multiple waves of this?
There were. There was a spring wave in 1918, but it was hit or miss. It missed more than it hit. For example, Los Angeles didn't have a single influenza death in the spring of 1918. It missed most of the world. It was pretty widespread in Western Europe. And it certainly hit some cities, hit about half the US military camps. But as I said, it was hit or miss. So you can't really compare it to what we've experienced here. My speculation was that the virus was still learning. It was still adapting to humans. It wasn't as good at infecting people as it later became. The first wave was also pretty mild as a general rule. It was so mild, in fact, that there were medical journal articles saying this looks and smells like influenza, but it's not killing enough people, so it can't be influenza. The second wave developed during the summer, and that was lethal. That was the wave that people think of when they think of the 1918 pandemic, with the death tolls and the probably, I said at the beginning, probably 60% to 2/3 of the entire death toll of a 2-year period was compressed into a 14 or 15 weeks.
So did this particular influenza strain, what happened to it? Did it burn out?
Yeah, eventually, it didn't so much burn out. It's again, a very rapidly mutating virus, much more rapidly mutating than COVID-19, which is a good thing. That COVID-19, I don't think there's any danger of it becoming more virulent. There hasn't been a sign anywhere in the world of that happening. Uh, but the virus itself, my guess is it mutated this is speculation, can't prove it. But I think the virus probably mutated toward mildness, which is, like most other influenza viruses. At the same time, people's immune system had seen it already. So they were better able to defend themselves against it naturally. And that combination, meant that it became seasonal influenza. And in fact, that virus, or its mutated descendants, but basically that virus continued to circulate in the United States until 1957, when it was replaced by another pandemic virus. COVID-19 is different. I think it was born ready. It's was already highly transmissible when it, the first signs of it that we've seen, it was already very, very good at infecting people. There is speculation right now that a dominant strain of the virus is a little bit better at infecting people than the initial strains, that there has been some mutation. That's not clear at this point, but either way, it's not more virulent. Rather than take up more time, I'll ask another question.
Just a couple of more questions. The Spanish flu lasted, was it 2 years? And I there's
3 years, 1918, 1919, and you could count 1920. But some people do, some don't.
And so, today with COVID-19, I mean, we've had a couple of months of extreme racial tensions and social unrest. And I understand that during the Spanish flu epidemic, there was red summer, where there was months of race riots. In your research, do you have anything that can you talk about the interplay between the Spanish flu, the Spanish flu epidemic and red summer of 1990?
I don't think there was, there was a third wave in late winter 1919. Incidentally, that's extremely unusual that you have 2 waves of influenza in the same influenza season. It's an indication of just how fast the virus was mutating. But I don't know of any impact. And I was quite, interested in Red Scare and so forth. 1919, as I said at the beginning of this, that's actually one of my original intent in writing the book was about 1919.
There's been, people have made some compelling arguments that African Americans are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. Was that the case with the Spanish?
That was not the case. Okay. In fact, there's pretty good data from the Army on African American soldiers, and they tended, for whatever strange reason, somewhat marginally less, but less morbidity. And fewer people got sick. However, if they did get sick, they were more likely to die. And I've seen some civilian data that was pretty similar to that. That seems to be the case. I've never really seen a cogent explanation for that, particularly regarding in the military.
Okay. I'm just going to ask a couple of questions from people here who are on our live feed. One question is, what is your view of how Dr. Bonnie Henry handled COVID-19 in Vancouver, British Columbia?
I don't have any idea.
Okay. All right. So we'll go to the next question. What is your opinion on how Sweden has responded to COVID-19?
Yes. I don't think their experiment is turning out so well. They have one of the highest per capita, if not highest per capita, death tolls in the world. If you adjust for population, they'd be considerably worse than the United States. And the last time I looked, they only had about 7 or 8% of the population exposed. For those people who don't know, Sweden was trying to get to herd immunity. They were not closing down the economy. They were urging social distancing. They were trying to protect the elderly, who were, of course, particularly vulnerable. And I'm over 70, so that would count among that group. They made a rational, informed decision to go this route. And you can, perhaps in the long run, when all the data is collected, 2 years from now, it'll turn out they made the right decision. But right now, I think it looks like they made the wrong decision.
It just seems like with all the news and all the things that we're saying, it just doesn't seem like there is an end in sight with this. However, history kind of tells us something different. What impact did the 1918 flu have on the following decade?
That's hard to say, because the war, it's difficult to separate it from the war. Fitzgerald wrote, all gods dead, all wars fought, all faith and man shaken. That was sort of an attitude of the 20s. And I think it contributed to the roaring 20s, the idea of, nothing matters, so let's party. I think influenza was part of that. But the war was such a disillusioning event. Wilson sends the United States into the war based on all these principles. And I could go into it, but briefly, he got influenza during the peace conference, mentally disoriented, physically weak. He was insistent upon all the principles America had gone to, or he said we were going to war over, until he got sick. And afterwards, he simply caved in on practically everything. I think his mental condition and the disease had a major impact on that. Go into detail on that in the book. But he was called the greatest fraud on earth by John Maynard Keynes. So that whole, millions of people, the U.S. got off so lightly in the war compared to millions of soldiers and European soldiers who died. We lost about 115,000, something like that total, about half to influenza and half to combat. But you can't separate them. However, so the decade was one of disillusionment and, a sense of fate and so forth. But I think influenza definitely played a role in that. If Christopher Isherwood wrote Berlin Stories, from which one of my favorite movies, I think a great movie, Cabaret, was based on that. And when the Nazis entered Berlin in 1933, he compared it to influenza. He said you could feel it like influenza in your bones. This sense of dread, this aching, the fact that 15 years after the pandemic, he would use that analogy. He would expect his readers to understand it and for it to resonate with his readers, I think is an indication that influenza was sort of almost a subconscious but very real impact on the way people were thinking.
Okay,
go ahead.
There's another question here. Given that a virus will mutate and create new strands over time, should we be focused on a vaccine or should we be focused on treatments?
Well, it's not an either or. A vaccine is definitely the answer. This virus, the spike protein, which is the target for a vaccine, is particularly stable. even in the viruses that have mutated where they are hypothesized that it's more contagious, not yet proven, and so considerable pushback on that hypothesis. But the spike protein itself has remained stable. So it's a remarkably stable part of that virus, which means what your vaccine is going to target, it'll hit that target. As opposed to influenza, the part of the influenza virus that a vaccine targets is part of the virus that mutates the most, which is why you need a different vaccination every year. Measles mutates as fast as influenza, much faster than COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 to be more technically accurate. But the part of the measles virus that the vaccine targets and the immune system targets if you're naturally infected does not mutate. So the vaccine for measles is 97 to 98% effective. And, I'm not saying that a vaccine for COVID-19 will be as effective as measles, but the fact that the spike protein, anyway, it's back to what I said earlier, it's not either or. This virus is going to be around essentially forever. With or without a vaccine, I think human immune systems will probably get better at responding to it. But you're still going to need the drugs.
In your research, did you ever explore kind of the psychological impact that the pandemic had on the masses? I mean, did it cause mental health issues? Did it cause PS?
I'm sure it did, but it's not something that I really looked at. And remember, we're dealing with it's already the length of time we've already dealt with it. In 1918, it was gone. And life had already gotten back to normal. The whole duration thing that I spoke of earlier is one of the biggest differences between the two viruses. They're clearly the virus itself, well recognized, caused mental problems, including schizophrenia. The people Oliver Sacks wrote about in The Awakening hypothesized that they were actually victims of the 1918 pandemic. There was a disease in the 20s that occurred, widespread, disappeared, called encephalitis lethargica, which is sort of self-explanatory. Strongly hypothesized that was a result of influenza, but you were asking more about not what the virus explicitly did, but about the impact psychologically is a little different, although it may be a distinction without a difference. But
I guess our last question here, how do you think history may look back at our current pandemic, given what we know now?
Well, I think the first comment by a historian or assessment would be that at least in the United States, the response was incomprehensible.
Wow.
That with all the World Health Organization rated the abilities, the pandemic readiness of basically every country in the world. And the US came out number one. We had the most resources, we had all this pandemic preparedness plans, but none of that mattered. And largely because Trump initially didn't want to take it seriously. We had the debacle over the testing, put us behind the curve, and we're still there. He wouldn't use the Defense Production Act. We still shortages of PPEs today. We have shortage of testing materials today. I mean, that's one of the reasons we have problems with testing is, you don't have the reagents. the swabs. Yeah, so at least in the US, it would be, he's pulling out of the World Health Organization as a political statement because he's trying to blame them. How do you pull out of in the middle of a pandemic, pull out of an organization that tries to share information and coordinate things? If there's one thing that demonstrates the globalization, it's a pandemic. Whether it's the Zika virus or Ebola or HIV or Lyme disease from Connecticut. Connecticut got its disease. A disease can occur anywhere. It's going to spread around the world. So why you withdraw from the only organization in the world where it's designed for surveillance and sharing information, I mean, it's crazy. There are other countries that have acted in a much more comprehensible and effective, most importantly, effective way. Merkel is a physicist. That's her training.
Yes.
Germany also has a federal system, so she can't simply dictate to the states.
Wow.
Similar situation that we're in, and yet if you compare the two countries, there isn't. And there are other countries that have done very well. I keep mentioning Germany because they have done well. They're not an Asian country. You can talk about different cultures in Asia, but their culture is similar to ours. And Italy started out behind the curve, and you look at the graph of the cases there and so forth. So I think the biggest puzzle will be what happened in the United States, and chiefly because we had the resources, we just didn't pull the trigger on them and didn't follow the pandemic plan.
Wow. Well, Mr. John Berry, it has indeed been an honor. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your scholarship. Thank you for sharing your scholarship and your knowledge with us. And I'd like to thank everybody who participated virtually. If you haven't received a copy of the book, just message us and we're happy to mail a free copy of the book to your home. So thank you very much. Everybody be well and continue to be safe.
Thank you very much.
Take care now.
Thanks.